How was Albert Einstein's brain stolen 7 hours after his death? We'll explain in this video.
On April 17, 1955, Albert Einstein was rushed to the hospital with chest pains. He didn't know it at the time, but the largest artery in his body, the aorta, had an aneurysm in the abdominal section that had swelled and ruptured, causing internal bleeding, a condition known as an abdominal aortic aneurysm. At the time, he was busy preparing a speech to be broadcast on television to celebrate Israel's 7th anniversary. His doctors wanted to operate on him immediately, but Einstein, who had undergone the same procedure 8 years earlier, must have understood that his time had come. He famously refused the surgery with these immortal words, "I want to go when I want to. It is tasteless to prolong life artificially. I have done my share, it is time to go. I will do it elegantly." And indeed, in the early hours of the next day, he passed away at Princeton Hospital. Fans of the series Chaos may know the name of this hospital. Although the hospital shown in the series has nothing to do with where Einstein actually died, the show's writers likely chose the name on purpose. But the most interesting part of the story happened during Einstein's autopsy. The pathologist performing the autopsy, Thomas Harvey, removed Einstein's brain from his body just 7 hours after his death without the family's permission. He then preserved it by injecting it with 10% formalin. His goal was to study what he believed was a one-of-a-kind brain to discover what made the great genius so intelligent. However, Einstein detested being idolized and had requested that his body be cremated and his ashes secretly scattered. In short, Harvey had completely violated Einstein's last will and testament. And it wasn't just his brain. He also removed Einstein's eyeballs and gifted them to his ophthalmologist Henry Abrams. When Dr. Harvey realized the heat was on, he approached Einstein's son Hans and managed to convince him of the importance of what he had done, obtaining retroactive permission. This allowed him to escape legal liability, but Hans had one condition. His father's brain was to be examined only for research purposes, and the findings had to be published in reputable academic journals. Harvey promised to do so and said he would publish his findings within a year at the latest. And since that day, Einstein's brain has been the subject of multiple studies. What did researchers find, you ask? Can we find the traces of this tremendous genius in his brain? Let's take a look. First, let me tell you about a persistent myth regarding Einstein. The claim that his school grades were as bad as ours, despite his genius. It's not hard to see why people want to believe this. If even Einstein was treated like an idiot in school, then maybe we can become like Einstein one day too. This is partly why I wanted to make this video. If you correctly identify what made Einstein Einstein, you might be able to be like him. Or even better. But if you want to succeed, you first need to stop lying to yourself. Of course, school grades alone are not enough to determine one's future, but that doesn't change the fact that Einstein's grades were quite good. How do we know this? Take a look at this high school report card from September 30, 1896. Just as it is today, the highest grade in Switzerland in the late 1800s was 6, and the lowest was 1. If you look closely at the report card, you can see he got a 6 in subjects like algebra, geometry, physics, and history, a 5 in chemistry, natural history, and German language and literature, and a 4 in drawing and geography. His lowest grade was a 3 in French language and literature. Not bad at all. And Einstein wasn't just successful in high school. Einstein's mother, Pauline, wrote a letter to her sister during his first years of school, saying, "Yesterday Albert got his report card. Again, he was the top of his class and his report card is wonderful." So, Einstein was a very successful student throughout his school life. Of course, like any student, he had his run-ins with teachers. For example, a middle school teacher at what was then called the Luitpold Gymnasium said, "I wish Einstein had never been my student." But the reason wasn't that Einstein was lazy. It was because he would sit in the back row and often smile while the teacher was talking. His teacher thought Einstein was disrespectful and at one point angrily told him, "You'll never amount to anything." But we can't judge a person's entire school life based on a few anecdotes like this. You have to look at their overall performance and grades, and when you do, you see that Einstein was not a failing student at all. So why do people keep spreading this nonsense? As I said, there's a comforting aspect to believing that Einstein too was misunderstood by the education system. And yes, Einstein, like many of us, hated the militaristic tone and systematic approach of schools. He wrote about this repeatedly in his letters, but that wasn't the only reason. Another potential source of the myth about Einstein's bad grades was the Swiss grading system. Einstein was born in the German Empire on March 14, 1879, and attended school there until high school. In the German school system, a 1 was the highest grade and a 6 was the lowest, the exact opposite of Switzerland. Therefore, his report cards before he started school in Switzerland were filled with 1s, which were the highest grades. But many people confuse this with the Swiss system and mistakenly think they were the lowest grades. To make things even more confusing, the high school he attended in Switzerland followed the German grading system until 1896, his last year of school. Only then did they switch to the system I just showed you, where 6 was the highest grade and 1 was the lowest. All of this fueled the confusion, but from his family's letters and other surviving records, we can see that Einstein's grades were always good or very good. So what was the secret to Einstein's great grades or his later blooming genius? Could the secret be in his brain? This is a question that has fascinated scientists for decades. Can we specifically pinpoint what makes geniuses in their brains? Are these geniuses born that way, or do certain regions of their brains develop more because they obsess over a particular topic? Can we distinguish between the two? Thanks to the hasty decision of pathologist Harvey, who was captivated by the greatness of the genius and the mystery lying before him, we have some clues. After removing Einstein's brain, Harvey took dozens of photos of it and, together with his mentor Harry Zimmerman, divided it into 240 pieces, each about 10 cubic centimeters. From these pieces they prepared microscope slides. The brain sections were based on the cerebral cortex atlas published by von Economo and Kaskinos in 1925 and largely followed the brain regions determined by Brodmann in the 19th century. In other words, the sections were selected to correspond to the brain's specialized functional groups. But the problem was that neither Harvey nor his mentor Zimmerman had any expertise in neuroscience or the brain. They were both pathologists and could at most identify specific pathological conditions like brain injuries or hemorrhages. They lacked the expertise to uncover the secrets of the extraordinary brain they had. Because of this, Harvey was never able to keep his promise to Hans Einstein to publish within a year. He couldn't find anything to publish because he didn't know what he was looking for. This quickly became a big problem. Although he had obtained Hans's permission, the chief of his hospital decided that wasn't enough to forgive what he had done, and he was forced to resign a few days later for violating ethical rules. Harvey, unable to find a job for a long time in New Jersey, moved to the Midwest with his 2 large jars containing Einstein's brain and started working as a general practitioner. Harvey was described as quite eccentric, even a dreamer, and no academic took him seriously. For 30 years after Einstein's death, he couldn't convince anyone to study the brain. Finally, he traveled across the United States to give the brain to Einstein's granddaughter, who lived in California, but she also refused to take it. Einstein's brain had become a curse. After all these events and a long journey from place to place with the brain, Harvey finally returned to where he started and delivered the jars containing the brain pieces to the pathologist who was hired to his old position. His 40-year adventure thus came to an end. After that point, researchers began to show a little more interest in Einstein's brain. The first study on Einstein's brain was published in 1999, 44 years after Einstein's death. The researchers examined the remaining brain parts and the original photos, and the findings have been quite interesting so far. First of all, Einstein's brain was not bigger than average. On the contrary, it was quite small. The brain of a man of Einstein's age and weight should have been around 1,400 grams. But his was only 1,230 grams. As you may recall from videos about animal intelligence, when it comes to brains, there is no rule that bigger is better. For example, a brain can be relatively small but filled with tighter neural connections and therefore have a higher processing capacity. But variations beyond this were also found in Einstein's brain. Let me show you a few directly. Look at this average human brain. This is your frontal cortex, the front part of your brain. This is the right hemisphere and this is the left hemisphere. The gap in between is the longitudinal fissure, which separates the 2 brain hemispheres and contains the connective bridge called the corpus callosum. If you look closely, there are roughly 3 lines or gyri in the front of the brain. 1, 2, 3. Now let's look at one of the photos of Einstein's brain taken by Harvey from the same angle. The fissure separating the 2 hemispheres is here. Now let's count the main lines again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Looks like he has 1 extra gyrus. This extra fold is in the right frontal lobe, which is related to nonverbal mathematical-like abilities. Not surprising, right? There's more. Look at this massive fold in the same photo. Now look at the standard human brain. There is no such fold. This region is a part of the motor cortex known as the hand motor knob, or the omega sign, because of its resemblance to the Greek letter omega. This area is responsible for the dexterous movements of our hands and fingers. We already know from previous studies that people who started playing the violin between the ages of 6 and 14 have a similar knob in their brains. So, just by looking at this brain, we can say that Einstein played the violin with his right hand and started before the age of 14. Indeed, Einstein started playing the violin at age 6, encouraged by his pianist mother, and never put it down for the rest of his life. Let's look at another photo. Here we see the front of Einstein's left brain. Look, the fissure that divides the brain in half is here again. Even if you know nothing about the brain, does anything abnormal catch your eye based on what you've seen so far? Look at the front of it. In a normal person, the same structure should be like the others. This is the motor cortex, which controls our voluntary functions like hand movements. Another finding, which I can't show you with a photo, was reached by microscopically counting the nerve cells in Einstein's brain sections. The number of neurons in Brodmann area 39 on the left side of the brain was found to be lower than in a normal person. This area is related to understanding words and language perception. And indeed, Einstein couldn't speak fluently until he was 6 years old and suffered from dyslexia-like problems for a long time, such as not being able to put his thoughts into writing, forgetting words, or reading aloud. So, unlike some other geniuses, Einstein didn't learn to read at age 2 and start pondering abstract mathematics at age 4. I'll come back to this point in a moment. By the way, let me tell you that the most pronounced differences in Einstein's brain are, interestingly, in the areas related to motor functions and senses. This also explains another fact we know about Einstein very well. Einstein did not think in words or writing. In fact, he would laugh when people told him that most people have an inner voice that thinks in words. Einstein thought more in colors and music, meaning he was a synesthete. For example, when he got stuck on a problem, he would sometimes play the violin for hours instead of doing calculations, and then he would suddenly stop and say, "Aha, I've got it," and then put his thoughts into mathematics. Additionally, Einstein's way of perceiving the universe was quite extraordinary. When Einstein thought about the universe, instead of relying on mathematics or experiments like other physicists, he drew strength from aesthetics. The best person to describe this is another great physicist who said, Einstein would not try to build a theory that fits observation. Whereas most people do that. Einstein would approach the subject very differently. He would try to think, if I were God, would I have created this part of the universe this way? And based on his answer to that, he would decide whether he liked a theory or not. This is a very interesting life philosophy that draws its power from aesthetics, and it guided Einstein correctly throughout his life. But at the same time, this aesthetic approach hindered his discovery of the general theory of relativity for about 2 years. Because he preferred the more aesthetically pleasing and mathematical path, he constantly went down the wrong roads. When he finally set aside his intuition and let himself be guided by the flow of mathematics, he was able to develop the general theory of relativity, which explains the interaction of mass with the fabric of space-time. Seeing the success this change of perspective brought him, he spent the rest of his life building his ideas with a purely mathematical perception, far from aesthetics. This, frankly, resulted in him being relatively less productive in the second half of his life. Also, because he built the theory of relativity on classical physics, he could never fully embrace quantum mechanics, which tore classical physics to pieces, and this led him to make many mistakes. These are very interesting points that are subjects for other videos. In any case, of course, some other findings in Einstein's brain reflect his genius in mathematics and physics. For example, the left parietal lobe, which is especially responsible for mathematics, reading long texts, writing, and symbolic thinking, is 15% larger than normal. Additionally, some studies show that the hippocampus, which is associated with memory in the left brain, and the neocortex, which is related to high-level cognitive functions, are relatively large. Finally, the corpus callosum, which connects the two brain hemispheres, was also denser than in a normal person. This explains why his brain worked like a supercomputer. In short, there are definitely discernible differences in Einstein's brain. Now, the critical question is this: was Einstein born with this brain anatomy, and was that why he was so intelligent? Or did his years of dedicating himself to high-level mathematics and physics cause the related regions of his brain to develop over time? Let's be clear about one thing. The brain is by no means a static structure. It's more like a warm plastic that you can bend and shape as you wish. We call this neuroplasticity. For example, when you first learn about mathematics or physics in elementary school, some of your brain's 100 billion neurons form brand new connections to process this new information. The more you immerse yourself in these areas and the more you work on what you don't understand, the connections get stronger and increase in number. In other words, as you learn, the structure of your brain changes. On the other hand, these connections are often microscopic in size, so it's very difficult for them to create macroscopic differences big enough to affect the brain's folds, as we saw in the photos earlier. For example, the human brain has already reached 90% of its adult form by the age of 6. Therefore, if experience affects brain folds, that effect must start before the age of 6. And we know that Einstein wasn't pondering physics at that age. Einstein's interest in science began at age 5 with a compass he received from his father, but he only started thinking deeply about these topics 5 to 10 years later. On the other hand, we still know very little about the effect of our experiences in later years on brain folds and macroanatomy. Therefore, in light of the current data, we can say that Einstein most likely was born with at least a significant portion of these variations in his brain. On the other hand, many historians of physics agree that the main factors that made Einstein who he was were his environment and the events that happened in his life. The focus here was on his brain because that was the topic, and we didn't look at his experiences, what he went through, or the events that shaped his character and way of thinking. But I can tell you this: Einstein did not become a genius just by sitting around thanks to his innate abilities. For example, the learning difficulties he experienced as a child probably forced him to think and learn in different and new ways. Einstein also knew how to obsess over specific problems and pursue them stubbornly. Even while working at a patent office to earn his financial independence, he never stopped thinking about physics problems and following the work of the most respected academics in his field. It was thanks to this diligence, perseverance, and determination that he was able to turn his talent into something productive. Otherwise, nobody discovers the secrets of the universe just by sitting around. As research upon research has shown, in many cases, genius is not just about genes, brain anatomy, hard work, luck, socioeconomic status, or environment. It's about all of them in different amounts in different situations. And yes, maybe Einstein was able to turn some things in his favor more easily thanks to the genes or brain he was born with. Or maybe you weren't born with a brain like Einstein's, or maybe your school grades are worse than his. You can't change that now. But there are things you can change, and many people barely use the things within their control, like the power of neuroplasticity or the ability to put themselves in a position to achieve success. Not doing these things and then claiming, "My brain isn't like Einstein's, that's why I couldn't be a genius," is a bit of a cop-out. In upcoming videos, I'll give you some examples of how pure interest and proper guidance can transform you. But for now, let me just say this: the next time you learn something new or think deeply about a topic, don't just think that you are gaining new information. Imagine that the connections in your brain are physically changing and transforming. You will see that this will also increase the pleasure you get from the subject.